Next topic. This one's really fun. Like on Reddit, there was a question posed: what's the most underrated and overrated stats for drafting?
Right here.
Johnny, did you want to go ahead and talk me through some of your best underrated stats that you look to when you're on draft day and you're trying to decide between a couple guys?
Yeah, so I think that this is such a fun question because every year we have meetings about it. We talk about it with our listeners. What do they like to listen to? I mean, even last week when we were doing Matthew Berry's 100 Facts article, deciphering what facts we want to pay attention to and what we don't, and how you can manipulate numbers. So I just thought that this was a really fun question. One, from a standpoint of like how often we do this, as far as grabbing stats that we like, and then really thinking about it, like, is it really meaningful what we're doing it with that stat, or is it something that we're just talking about? And so for me, I wrote down for my overrated stat that I think is most overrated when it comes to drafting, and that is using what a player did last year and transferring over those stats to make the full argument for a player this year. Now, oftentimes you will hear us refer back to players and how they finished as just a touchstone. So I want to see, has he done it? What did he do last year as maybe help to gauge what he might do? But it, like, perfect example is when someone kills it the year before in fantasy, right? And then you're automatically assuming that he's going to repeat it last year, like very similar to what Pat Mahomes did when he scored 50 touchdowns. And then we all said, but how can you not take Pat Mahomes anything but the first quarterback off the board? And what happened? You took Lamar Jackson in the 13th, 14th round, and he outscored Pat Mahomes. Like, stats don't transfer over, so don't look into that. So I would say that is the most overrated stat line. And then I'll tell you my underrated after you tell me your overrated.
Yeah, so overrated for me was kind of yards per rush, and I like what you said there about last year. But I think you can just specifically say whatever they did last year. You could pinpoint any little thing that they did last year and try to make your case. So obviously that gets tougher if you've got a guy who's only been in the year 1 year or 2 years. You only have that small sample size. But when you have guys that have consistently done it, and you're looking at that. And for me, my whole thing with stats is they've got to be used more as a tiebreaker. They can't paint your entire story. If you're stuck between two guys, you got to look at stats that kind of, do that, that tiebreaker for you. So for me, my overrated is yards per rush, because my underrated stat is actually, offensive line play and yards per touch before contact. So basically saying, if I'm looking at two guys, we're talking about, Chris Carson versus Le'Veon Bell, and I'm looking at offensive line play, and I'm really torn between those two. I'm looking at Seattle's line and saying, look, it's better. I'm just going to have to go with Chris Carson if I think in my mind that they're equal, but I need to have some sort of tiebreaker. That's kind of my thing. And then yards per touch before contact. Johnny, this one's just so great because this tells me what the running back does without the line. So if the line was pretty bad and he got he's got a high yards per touch before contact, he's doing a lot of the work. And then if he's got a great line, I mean, hold on to your, shorts. He's taking off, So yeah. Those are kind of my opposite ends of the spectrum there. But what about you? What's one of your favorite underrated stats?
So my favorite underrated would be, well, that in the thread that was talked about, O-line rankings came up a lot, which we are a huge advocate for O-line rankings. And it is something that does come in the draft kit. We do put that up there. Yeah. So make sure if you have not ordered the draft kit yet, you could still pre-order for one more week at the $10 price before it goes up to $15. So make sure you do that. But we do the O-line ranking. And the reason why I like that so much, and strength of schedule was another thing that people brought up as like an overrated thing, right? Because things change throughout the year so much. On the contrary, with the O-line rankings, so every year, Pro Football Focus puts out their O-line rankings, which is how we gauge our O-line rankings in our draft kit. And So I went back to last year, because people say, well, it's like strength of schedule, it changed a lot. So sure, you can go on preseason O-line rankings, but does it really matter? Is it overrated, right? So I dove into it a little bit, and it turns out, so last year Pro Football Focus before the season put out 15 O-line rankings and before the season, and then they did it at the end of the season. Out of those 15 teams, only 3 teams did not make that they put on before, did not make it to the end and being a top 15 O-line by the end of the season. Those were the Bears, the Panthers, and the Rams. Those were the only teams. All the other teams were still top 15 O-lines. The 3 that snuck up were the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which was a surprise to me. They had one of the best O-lines. And then the 49ers, which they had ranked 16 coming into the season. They jumped up to 14. And then the Oakland Raiders snuck in at the 15 spot for the best offense line. So you can see the turnover is not significant throughout the year of rankings for offensive line. So it is a very, very good stat to look at, similar to what Travis was saying with the rushing. It is a good indicator of running backs who will get, if you think they're going to get a good opportunity, and that pairs with a good offensive line, or similar to quarterbacks too. If the quarterback has a good offensive line, he's generally going to have more time to throw. So that should be really, really good. But I will say my ultimate, but I didn't even see my ultimate. And it's got to be the ultimate, using the stats against people for smoke screens to get them to think what you want them to think. That's the best and the most underrated stat that we could give. It's giving stats for players that you don't like, but painting them in a good picture so somebody else likes them, and they take them and don't take your guy. That's the best one.
Man, you're just scheming over there. I love it.
It's so funny you say that, Johnny, because on that note, I was referencing back to Matthew Berry's article. I told y'all last week I love it, and I've been spending a lot of time with it. And for me, one of the stats that's really
you've
underrated.
Been spending a lot of time with it? Like, does Austin know this? Like, have you guys been going on walks and
exactly.
Daydreaming in the park?
Exactly.
Oh,
I just printed it and keep it folded up in a pocket on my chest. It's
Nice.
a big deal.
Nice.
But for me, one of the bigger underrated things is thinking about how teams change in the off season, right? And so I was like really looking at the Los Angeles Rams, for example. Matthew Berry talks about this in the article. Like Brandon Cooks last season on the Rams had 72 targets, but he's gone now, right? He's on the Texans. So we get to look and see, well, where could those 72 targets fall? And in that math, I really have a lot of fun sort of imagining what's possible. And Matthew Berry's article talks about Woods, really having a come up this season based on some of these numbers that go his direction. So it's in that type of stat that feels really underrated or undervalued in terms of how everybody's looking at these teams' makeups. And that's where I have a lot of fun sneaking in and sort of, as Johnny's saying, coming up with smoke screens, coming up with distractions like, Robert Woods is going to take all 72 of Brandon Cook's targets. We know that may not be possible, but that's where I have a lot of fun and find the value in my stats for drafting.
Yes. Yeah. Vacated opportunity is a huge thing. So Chelsea, I love that you brought that up, because when you're painting the picture at the draft kit, we give you profiles on all these players. We have to come to ourselves as these, analysts breaking down these stats and say, what happened with this team in the offseason? Right. So like when I talked about offensive line, something you could do if you think, Pro Football Focus has them as a low offensive line. Okay, well, what happened? Who did they draft? Did they pick up a free agent? Like, could this line actually be in set up for positive regression? Well, if so, then you could kind of bank on a guy or a player that you really like. So, yes, I think that article that Matt Berry does is great, because it shows you how fun fantasy can be when you start to use the stats to paint the stories that you want. And that's what we're doing this for. We're here to have fun. We're here to, paint these stories for guys that we like. I'm all about it.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Whisperers podcast. You can hear more from John and Travis on Google Play, SoundCloud, and iTunes. You can also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at TF Whisperers.